Hi, I'm Andrew Torres, and this is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where is the church going?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything.
Welcome to episode 99 of the Naked Mormonism Podcast, a serial Mormon history podcast. Today is Thursday, April 19th, 2018. My name is Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. On this episode, we wrap up 1841 and get into early 1842. Joe revises the Book of Mormon and calls it the most correct book of any on the earth. Ebenezer Robinson's belief in the morality of monogamy likely conflicts with his position as chief editor of the Times and Seasons, so Brigham Young has to step in and stop that from being a problem. The Book of Abraham is finally published, and we discuss how many wives Joe took in the rest of 1841 and 1842 alone, his most active year in building his harem. After that, we discuss a recent Deseret News headline reporting on President Nelson's sermon to a congregation of Mormons in Kenya. Let's get into it. Joseph Smith gave a sermon on November 28, 1841, in a small council with some elders. This is from the Dan Vogel History of the Church, Volume 4, page 456. Quote, I spent the day in the council with the 12 apostles at the house of Brigham Young, conversing with them upon a variety of subjects. Brother Joseph Fielding was present, having been absent 4 years on a mission to England. I told the brethren that the Book of Mormon was the most correct of any book on earth and the keystone of our religion, and a man would get nearer to God by abiding by its precepts than by any other book. End quote. Mormons today are quick to parrot this same line. Now, the Book of Mormon may have some issues, but it's the most correct book of any book on earth. This assertion is far too problematic to contend with here, but I'll just say if the Book of Mormon is indeed the most correct book on the planet, why have hundreds of apologists and scholars been working to prove its most basic truth claims to no avail for more than a century? And truth is self-evident, right? It doesn't require faith for truth to be true. A rock is always a rock, regardless of how many people want to sincerely believe that it's actually a phaser gun. Moving on, just a small little introduction into where current Mormon beliefs come from. Prior to the death of Don Carlos Smith, Don's good friend Ebenezer Robinson had begun a project to publish a Nauvoo edition of the Book of Mormon. Robinson was sent on a mission to Cincinnati to collect the paper and typeset for this purpose in mid-1840. The mission was met with, let's just say, measured success. Robinson was able to find a typeset and paper at a reasonable price in Cincinnati, and then he put them on board a steamer that was headed for Nauvoo. Quoting from Ebenezer Robinson's autobiography, you will find a link to this in the show notes. Quote, I soon found the other foundry, and as I entered the office, I saw 3 gentlemen standing by the desk in conversation. I asked if Messrs. Gleason and Shepard were in. A gentleman stepped forward and said, My name is Gleason. I said, I have come to get the Book of Mormon stereotype. Mr. Shepard stepped forward and said, When that book is stereotyped, I am the man to stereotype it. I then handed him the book and told him what size type I wanted it done in. He took the book and went to a case of type the size I had named, and set up one line and counted the items in the line, then counted the number of lines in the page and multiplied the 2 numbers together, and then counted the number of pages in the book and multiplied the number of pages by the number of items in a page. When he said the stereotyping would amount to $550. I told him that I had $100 to pay in hand and would pay $250 more in 3 months or while he was doing the work, and the remaining $200 within 3 months after the work was done. He said, I will go with you to a good bookbinder around on Main Street, and taking me by the arm, we went directly to the bookbinder, who said he would bind 2,000 copies in good leather for $250, which was 12.5 cents apiece, end quote. Robinson had the contract signed for 2,000 copies more of the Book of Mormon to be printed by a Gentile printer. However, it was run by the prophet before the final manuscript finally went to print. This is from the Encyclopedia of Mormonism on byu.edu. Quote, Joseph Smith compared the printed text with the original manuscript and discovered a number of errors made in copying the printer's manuscript from the original. Thus, the 1840 edition restores some of the readings of the original manuscript. End quote. Ebenezer Robinson would continue in printing jobs connected with Mormonism for the rest of his life. He wrote of the circumstance surrounding the whereabouts of the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon in Oliver Cowdery's handwriting, which Joe used in order to correct the printing errors for this Nauvoo 1840 edition of the Book of Mormon. And to provide some context for this quote we're about to read, in 1889, Ebenezer Robinson began working as editor and printer for the Whitmerite Church periodical known as The Return. So the Times and Seasons had, he'd long since stopped associating with it by that time. This was called The Return that was run by the Whitmer's Church. In the August 1890 edition, Robinson gave his first-hand account of an interesting occurrence right before the cornerstone laying ceremony of the Nauvoo Temple in April 1841. And this is an occurrence concerning the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon in Oliver Cowdery's handwriting from 1829. This is his quote. Quote, after the brethren had assembled at the southeast corner of the foundation where the cornerstone was to be laid, President Joseph Smith said, Wait, brethren, I have a document I wish to put in the stone, and started for his house, which was only a few rods away across Main Street. I went with him to the house, and also 1 or 2 other brethren. He got a manuscript copy of the Book of Mormon and brought it into the room where we were standing, and said, I will examine to see if it is all here. And as he did so, I stood near him, at his left side, and saw distinctly the writing as he turned up the pages until he hastily went through the book and satisfied himself that it was all there. So Joseph Smith said, hey, I have something to put in the cornerstone of the Nauvoo Temple before we dedicate the cornerstone ceremony. And then he went back to his house and pulled out the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon. And then this is what he said, quote, I have had trouble enough with this thing, which remark struck me with amazement as I looked upon it as a sacred treasure. And then, of course, Ebenezer Robinson goes on to describe the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon that Joseph Smith was about to bury in the foundation. It was written on foolscap paper and formed a package, as the sheets lay flat of about 2 or 2.5 inches thick, I should judge. It was written mostly in Oliver Cowdery's handwriting, with which I was intimately acquainted, having set many pages of type from his handwriting in the church printing office at Kirtland, Ohio. Some parts of it were written in other handwriting. He took the manuscript and deposited it in the cornerstone of the Nauvoo house, together with other papers and things, including different pieces of the United States coins. I put in some copies of the Times and Seasons. All were carefully encased in sheet lead to protect the contents from moisture, and a stone had been cut to closely fit into the cavity which had been made in the cornerstone to receive these things, which stone was fitted in its place and cemented, when it was thought the papers and other articles would be preserved without decay or injury for ages, if not disturbed. End quote. Now this is interesting. And I think I said earlier, the Nauvoo Temple, it was actually the Nauvoo house that this was laid in the cornerstone of. But this is important because Joseph Smith buried the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon, at which time he said, I have had enough trouble with this thing. That, from the mouth of Joseph Smith when talking about the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon, after the 1840 Nauvoo edition of the Book of Mormon had already been published, he'd had enough trouble with this thing. But, I mean, honestly, the Book of Mormon had caused a lot of trouble for Joe, so, he didn't just publish the 1830 edition and then rest on his laurels. He was caught up in constant revision and correction and then interpretation of his seminal work since it hit the bookshelves. And it should be noted at this time, as we've previously discussed, Ebenezer Robinson was opposed to polygamy, as Joe was beginning to ramp it up in mid to late 1841. Now, polygamy was secretive, but the rumors were becoming too abundant to ignore by this point. Since the death of Don Carlos Smith in August of 1841, Ebenezer Robinson, who was his good friend, was left as sole editor of the Times and Seasons, which is the church published periodical. So to fill the gap and meet the editorial workload of the Times and Seasons, a friend of Robinson's by the name of Gustavus Hill was brought in to help with the editing work. The church periodical needed to be under Joe's constant control in order to make sure that unapproved information didn't make its way into the church's primary propaganda arm. The brethren met to determine what should be done with the Times and Seasons, and that was kind of beginning to wander slightly out of their control. In addition to their concerns about the Times and Seasons, the brethren had somehow flipped on whether or not Ebenezer Robinson had full approval to publish the 1840 Book of Mormon along with other standard works. So remember, the 1840 Nauvoo edition had been edited by and given the approval of Joseph Smith. However, in late 1841 and early 1842, that prior approval of the prophet was coming into question, given Robinson's later handling of certain information that was making its way into the Times and Seasons. So this was all kind of interconnected. Joseph Smith with the Book of Mormon manuscript saying, I've had enough trouble with this thing, published, by Ebenezer Robinson many, many years later. And then Ebenezer Robinson and Joseph's relationship being so good in Kirtland was beginning to deteriorate because Joseph felt like he was losing control of the Times and Seasons edited under the hand of Ebenezer Robinson. So finally, in a December 1841 conference with the elders, a motion was brought up for discussion. This is from the Dan Vogel History of the Church, Source and Text Critical Edition, Volume 4, page 457. Quote, attended a council of the 12 apostles at President Brigham Young's. Present Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, Willard Richards, Orson Pratt, Lyman White, John Taylor, and Wilford Woodruff. It was voted that Ebenezer Robinson be solicited to give up the department of printing the Times and Seasons to Elder Willard Richards. Voted that if Brother Robinson does not comply with this solicitation, Elder Richards be instructed to procure a press and type and publish a paper for the church. Moved by Elder Young and seconded by Elder Woodruff, that Lyman White and John Taylor present these resolutions to Brother Robinson. End quote. Ebenezer Robinson was skating awfully close to the line of apostasy with what he was publishing in the Times and Seasons. So, the brethren decided that the Times and Seasons was getting a little too far out of control and needed to be reined in. And this is how information was controlled in the early church. People were allowed to publish anything they wanted to about the church as long as it wasn't critical and the content passed the approval of the brethren first. We couldn't have any of those hard truths getting out there and poisoning the well of all those eager Gentile investigators. So finally, in January of 1842, Brigham Young tells of the meeting concerning the printing office and the grade of propaganda that Ebenezer Robinson was publishing. This is from the manuscript history of Bloody Brigham Young. Quote, January 17th, 1842. I met in council with the 12 at Joseph's office. We consulted in relation to the printing and publishing, the council being unanimously opposed to Ebenezer Robinson's publishing the Book of Mormon and other standard works of the church without being counseled so to do by the First Presidency. And then it continues on later. We return to Nauvoo on the 27th, and then finally on January 28th, we have this. The Lord having revealed through Joseph that the 12 should take in hand the editorial department of the Times and Seasons, I bought the printing establishment for and in behalf of the church from Ebenezer Robinson at a very exorbitant price. The reason I paid such a price was because the prophet directed the 12 to pay him whatever he asked. One item of his bill was $800 for the privilege of publishing the Times and Seasons or goodwill of the office. End quote. There it was. Joseph Smith delivered a revelation. We need to get the Times and Seasons out of Ebenezer Robinson's house. And if we can't, then Willard Richards, you start up your own printing press and procure press and the typeset in order to publish our own church newspaper because the Times and Seasons is out of our control. So here's the actual text of the revelation that Joseph Smith said. This is from the History of the Church, once again, Volume 4, page 492. Quote, I received the following revelation to the 12 concerning the Times and Seasons given January 28th, 1842. Verily, thus saith the Lord unto you, my servant Joseph, go and say unto the 12 that it is my will to have them take in hand the editorial department of the Times and Seasons, according to that manifestation which shall be given unto them by the power of my Holy Spirit in the midst of their council, saith the Lord. Amen. End quote. With that revelation delivered through Joseph Smith, as mouthpiece of God, commanding the Brethren to buy the Times and Seasons or take over the editorial department from Ebenezer Robinson. And with this corresponding entry in the manuscript history of Brigham Young, the printing press, the typeset, and the name, the copyright of the Times and Seasons were transferred from Ebenezer Robinson to Brigham Young on behalf of the church. Brigham Young was just a benefactor in this equation. The Times and Seasons started out as an independent propaganda publication arm of the church, and now it was finally time to put it into the hands of brethren in the church who were a bit more closely aligned with Joe's covert interests. Ebenezer Robinson was opposed to polygamy. Brigham Young, he was a little more privy to it. The Times and Seasons may have been purchased by Bloody Brigham Young, but he transferred the ownership of it to the church, and Joe assumed the role of editor-in-chief for a very short time. And Joe's editorial role in the Times and Seasons, it was largely ceremonial. Whiteout Willard Richards was quickly employed as the editor, who was doing the majority of the grunt work while Joe was too busy to actually contribute an editor's pen to the daily grind of regular printing duties. A few days after this transaction was made, John Taylor and Wilford Woodruff were appointed to management positions of the printing office per Brigham Young's manuscript history. While Joe did acquire the position of editor 2 weeks after this, his time was so fully absorbed in other affairs that editing and printing duties regularly defaulted to Whiteout Willard Richards, John Taylor, and a Willie Goat Wilford Woodruff. So what were these other affairs which so completely occupied Joseph Smith? Well, marital affairs, under the guise of righteous polygyny. That was a major occupation of his time, and we'll get to that in a minute. But let's discuss some of the other points that were occupying Joe's time. We've covered seemingly ad nauseum by this point Joe's various business enterprises in order to build his kingdom on the Mississippi. Everything needed to be constructed from the ground up, and eager businessmen were quite excited to capitalize on the Mormon refugees. Land prices were fluctuating quicker than Bitcoin. Public work projects were dreamt up and commissioned, yet never completed. A constant influx and outpouring of people moving in and out of Nauvoo, Saint and Gentile alike, in hopes of gaining either their salvation or their American dream, respectively. The dividing line between friend and foe was waxing rather blurry at this time, with every newcomer inducted into the ranks of a trusted elder within the church. The popular press was constantly ignoring the best parts of Mormonism and overstating the worst parts, with no real idea of what was truly going on behind closed doors in Nauvoo. A constant stream of propaganda needed to flow out of Nauvoo in order to combat the overwhelming negativity with which the majority of the populace viewed the deluded fanatical sect. Politicians needed coercion and lobbying, judges needed to be reminded of their place, and apostates needed punishment. Here's a fun little excerpt from Bloody Brigham Young about just one of these many apostates who started to gain a little bit too much notoriety to be able to ignore. Quote, March 11th, 1842, attended the High Council at the trial of Francis Gladden Bishop, who had set himself up as a prophet and revelator in the church. After his revelations were read, which were a bundle of nonsense and folly, they were committed to the flames, and he was cut off from the church and delivered over to the buffetings of Satan. End quote. Apostasy was still a manageable problem in Nauvoo. Wait another 2 years, and that will cease to be the case. And, all of these pressures listed previously, they were all convoluting to make life rather challenging for the 37-year-old prophet at this time. Then, add into this mix, tragedy struck in the Smith household again. Joseph and Emma's childbearing was fraught with difficulties from their first child in 1828, which only lived for a few hours, but was so disfigured that little Alvin was never considered viable. Then we had the twins, Thaddeus and Louisa, who both died a few hours after their childbirth due to being born premature. And then of their adopted twins that Joseph Smith and Emma took, we have Joseph and Julia Murdoch. Little young Joseph Murdoch had perished in 1832 before reaching 1 year of age due to complications of sickness. And then finally, we have Joseph Smith III, who was born in November of 1832. Joseph Smith III, he was able to reach maturity, and he would eventually lead the LDS reorganization in the early 1860s. He would only make it to 12 years old before his father was actually assassinated in Carthage. Then we have Frederick Granger William Smith, who was born in 1836. He would make it to the age of 25 years old before he passed away during the early stages of the reorganization. Then we also have Alexander Hale Smith, who would also age to maturity and live a ripe 81 years by the side of his brother, Joseph Smith III, as a leading figure of the RLDS Church. Now, beyond that, you can go back to listen to episode 94 when we talked about the death of Joseph's brother and son, both named Don Carlos Smith. Joseph's son, Don Carlos, was a mere 14 months old when he died, adding yet one more tragedy to an already stressed marriage fraught with hardship. And then on February 6th, 1842, where we are in our timeline right now, Joseph and Emma had yet another child who was born stillborn. And they didn't even give this child a name. You know, familial tragedies always take their toll on any person, but for somebody like Joseph Smith, who was already stressed with so many other irons in the fire, we can truly never know what the death of yet another child did to him and Emma and their psychological well-being. But personal tragedy was yet one more pressure to add into the mix. Joseph also had a very unique business proposition come along in March 1842, exhibiting Egyptian papyri written by the hand of Father Abraham himself. From the History of the Church, Volume 4, page 508, we find this lovely little quote. Quote, Thursday, March 1st, 1842. During the forenoon, I was at my office and the printing office, correcting the first plate or cut of the records of Father Abraham, prepared by Reuben Hedlock for the Times and Seasons, and in council in my office in the afternoon, at which time I explained many important principles in relation to progressive improvement in the scale of intelligent existence. I commenced publishing my translations of the Book of Abraham in the Times and Seasons. End quote. So yes, everybody, we have finally arrived at the greatly revered and also greatly lampooned Book of Abraham. All this time, 2.5 years of podcasting on Mormon history chronologically, we finally made it to the polarizing Book of Abraham. And I hate to do this, but we're going to withhold a proper examination of it for another day. I'm sorry to blue ball everybody on this whole bucket of fun that is the Book of Abraham, but we have a few other aspects of early 1842 Nauvoo history slated for the next couple episodes, after which we'll do the Book of Abraham a proper service with adequate due diligence. Continuing on, 1842 was also Joe's most active year for taking polygamist wives. 1841 ended with Joe having taken Louisa Beeman, Zina Diantha Huntington, and Prescindia Lathrop Huntington as wives. Those were his Nauvoo sealings as of early December 1841. We also have to throw in, we have Fanny Alger, in Kirtland, and then Lucinda Pendleton Morgan in Missouri. Those were always kind of known as Joe's first polygamous wives, but Nauvoo was a new grand theater in which he could conduct and solemnize dozens of marriages with very little repercussions. In 1842 alone, Joseph Smith took Agnes Moulton Coolbrith, who was the widow of his recently deceased younger brother, Don Carlos Smith, Sylvia Sessions, Mary Elizabeth Rollins, Patty Bartlett Sessions, Marinda Nancy Johnson Hyde, Elizabeth Davis, Sarah Kingsley, Delsina Johnson, Eliza R. Snow, and Sarah Ann Whitney. Oh, and also, Martha McBride. I forgot about that one. So 11 of Joe's 33 wives married to him just from January to August of 1842. Now, one more interesting piece to add into this is Nancy Maria Winchester. She may be considered wife number 12, as the surviving documentation of her sealing is non-existent, and the rest of the existent historical information concerning her marriage is scant, to say the least. It was just two first-hand accounts, which claimed that she was one of Joe's wives. Now, if we are able to ascribe an 1842 date to Joseph and Nancy Maria Winchester's marriage, then Winchester would have been 14 when she married Joseph Smith. Now, most historians have dated their marriage in 1843, putting her at the age of 15, but the evidence is so incredibly sparse concerning Nancy Maria Winchester that historians can't be certain of a proper date for their marriage. It is interesting to note that Benjamin Winchester, who's the older brother to Nancy, was called into a disciplinary council on January 12, 1842. Most historians ascribe Nancy Maria Winchester and Joseph's marriage in 43, but this disciplinary council for her older brother was in 1842. This is from Brigham Young's manuscript history on January 12, 1842. Quote, met in council with the 12 and suspended Benjamin Winchester for disobedience to the first presidency. End quote. So that Benjamin Winchester, that is the older brother to Nancy Winchester, and he was disciplined in January 1842 for disobedience, whatever that means. And unfortunately, historians have no further knowledge concerning the details of what Benjamin did to deserve derision and discipline from the Council of Apostles. The dating of Benjamin Winchester's discipline and the coinciding marriage to Nancy Winchester with an unknown date attached sometime from January 42 to November 43, that presents a possible confluence of events where historians could closer date Joe's courting efforts of Nancy. That's just the courting efforts, not the marriage. The marriage could have happened, months or possibly a year after this disciplinary council, but let me just construct a simple hypothetical for you. That, in my mind, it explains the available evidence. Let's just say, hypothetically, Joe was spending a little bit too much time around Nancy Winchester, maybe getting a little bit too friendly, and her older brother, Benjamin Winchester, started asking too many questions, and he was called in and disciplined for, quote-unquote, disobedience to the first presidency, right? Benjamin Winchester was disparaged, and his concerns surrounding Joe's, affinity towards his younger sister, Nancy, were well-founded. Joe would continue to court Nancy and then eventually coerce her for a number of months before he finally popped the question and was sealed to her. But, this scenario and, Benjamin's discipline being connected to Nancy and Joseph's relationship here, it's not theoretical, it's just hypothetical, but it does explain the available evidence in my mind. You judge it for yourself. This is what Todd Compton writes of Nancy Maria Winchester's marriage to the prophet, and this is from page 606 of In Sacred Loneliness. Quote, on May 27, 1842, Nancy Maria herself was inducted into the Relief Society. Nancy Winchester, probably the mother, continued to contribute to the society in 1842. On July 28, 1843, she was appointed to a 4-woman committee in the Nauvoo 3rd Ward, quote, to search out the poor and suffering, to call on the rich for aid, and thus, as far as possible, relieve the wants of all. Continuing with Compton, Nancy Maria must have married Joseph at about this time. Our best evidence for this union is Andrew Jensen, who lists Maria Winchester as one of Smith's wives. In addition, Orson Whitney, the son of Nancy Maria's friend Helen, also identified her as a Smith wife. These two witnesses, taken together, make a good case for Nancy as a plural spouse of Joseph. Though there is no date for her marriage to the prophet, the best hypothesis is that the ceremony took place in 1843, since the last recorded plural marriage to Smith took place on November 2nd, 1843. If so, she became his wife at the age of 14 or 15. Nothing more is known of this union. End quote. We must continue to keep polygamy in mind moving forward. The weight of polygamy on Joe's decision-making is worth taking note of. Let's take a step back, okay? A person's sexuality doesn't necessarily affect who they are. There's nothing saying that unequivocally a cis-heteromonogamy relationship is the optimal version of sexuality. There's a lot of claims out there that cis-hetero is the best system, and anything other than cis-heteromonogamy is somehow disgusting or evil, but there's no evidence to substantiate those claims. The fact that Joe wanted to have sex with so many women has absolutely zero impact on who he is as a human being. Joseph's sexual desires impacted who he was as a human being because of the decisions that he made in order to realize those desires. Now, there's this inherent hypocrisy in preaching chastity and then excommunicating people for unchristian-like conduct with women while simultaneously having a harem of concubines. People feel rightfully betrayed by such a discrepancy in doctrine and practice of the founding father of Mormonism. But also, if you want to have sex with a bunch of people, just go do it, okay? Don't tell people they can't and then make religious exemptions for you to do it. Also, don't lie to your partners about your other partners. Honesty and transparency keeps poly relationships alive and consensual. Just keep it among informed consenting adults, okay? We can argue about the definitions of those 3 crucial words, informed consenting adult, but those are the criteria for a moral relationship. All other details are merely incidental. My point with this digression is that Joe was violating all 3 of those criteria And he was also being dishonest with his relationships, and he allowed absolutely no transparency. That is 5 strikes against the way that Joseph Smith conducted himself sexually. And a person's sexuality isn't important to who they are, but the decisions they make to satisfy those desires are what deserve our attention. It's not irrational to conclude that Ebenezer Robinson was removed from his job of editor and printer of the Times and Seasons because he wasn't friendly to the idea that the prophet may have some girlfriends in addition to Emma. It's not irrational to conclude that Benjamin Winchester was punished for asking too many questions when the prophet got a little too friendly with his teenage sister. Decisions were made by Joe and his trusted elites which enabled him to violate all the criteria for healthy poly relationships. Joe used his position of prominence in his community, the prophet of God, to coerce women of all ages into non-consensual relationships, all while keeping all of these relationships secretive through complete dishonesty and corruption. And he did all of this while preaching monogamy and chastity from his Christian bully pulpit. When the assertion is made that Joseph had 33 wives and therefore he did something immoral, we lose sight of why what he did was wrong. A lot of incredibly good and moral people have had 33 partners in their lives. A lot of good and moral people have never had a partner in their life. A lot of terrible people have had dozens or no partners whatsoever. Simply put, the number of people with whom we have intimate relationships has no bearing on who we are as a human being. Those relationships may alter who we are, right? But the number of those relationships has no impact on who we are or how moral we are as a human being. How we acquire those relationships is where character judgments can be made. I think that's where the conversations that matter should be focused when concerning Joseph Smith's history with polygamy. Naked Mormonism isn't just a show about Mormon history. From time to time, headlines crop up with the modern Brighamite sect of Mormonism, which deserve our attention. For this purpose, we need our own news segment, which leads us to proudly debut The Angel's Trumpet. It couldn't be counted on any number of hands how many talks have been given in church and general conference on the importance of tithing. From seemingly innocuous talks about a person paying their tithing when they're in a tough situation and then, somehow a forgotten bank account emerges with the exact amount that the family needed. And, all the way across the gamut to talks about like a single mother choosing between fixing her car so she can get to work in order to feed her children and still paying tithing in spite of those financial hardships. These talks can be found in ward houses nearly every month, and in every single general conference has at least one talk of some sort on tithing. Now, from a belief perspective, and more importantly, a business perspective, tithing is crucial to the LDS business model. When tithing was made strictly mandatory in the early 1900s, the church was recovering from serious financial destitution whilst attempting to become accepted into the mainstream of American Christianity in order to, reap all of the benefits that happens to afford, being part of the majority. It wouldn't be until the 1950s that a temple was built outside of North America, and that was in a rich European country. But the 70s and 80s were really good for the church and many other extremely wealthy corporations. Like, come on, Reaganomics, baby. Since the 50s, the church has acquired hundreds of thousands of acres for cattle ranching and orchards, commercial business developments. They built multiple commercial shopping centers. They own media, insurance companies, counseling services, in addition to multiple nonprofit food production companies and thrift stores and psychiatric and family counseling services. The integral piece to making this whole system run successfully is the income the church pulls in from tithing. This money is essentially untraceable for any outside watchdog committee, and it's completely tax-free. Now, arguments can be made that making donations tax-free and tax-deductible, that can stimulate a nonprofit organization to provide social goods and services where government or for-profit entities might be lacking. You give a church a tax break, maybe they'll build a hospital or a school, or they'll commission some wells to be dug or something, At very least, they'll provide spiritual guidance and a sense of community to impoverished areas. those arguments can be made. And those arguments can be made that having those tax exemptions for religions are a good thing. But those arguments have little applicability to what we see really play out in practice. I'm not saying whether those arguments are good or they are flawed. I'm just saying that those arguments can be raised and they need to be contended with appropriately. And what we're about to discuss, I believe, reveals a bit about the church's priorities and current status. In episode 97, titled Lawsuits, Politics, and Temples, we discussed much of the church's financial and political outlook, given some indicators provided during April 2018 General Conference. I'd recommend listening to that if you haven't as a precursor to this segment. The relevant information is that we can easily track the church's growth by where they build their temples. Tithing is a compulsory tenet for temple attendance, so the church puts temples in areas where the tithing income will pay for that temple. If we're going to believe growth indicators by the church's own published statistics, the church is simply hemorrhaging members right now. With the constant death rate of the older Mormons, made up of, the greatest generation and the baby boomer generation, along with the younger Gen X and millennial generations simply not attending the church anymore, the LDS church may actually be experiencing a historic negative growth. Tithing income would be the best indicator of what current membership really looks like, but tithing numbers aren't available to us on the outside, so we simply have to view the statistics that are made available to us and extrapolate possible conclusions based on that information. Now, this negative growth trend is noted by believing and ex-believing forums alike. Here's from a Believing Mormons blog in an article titled 4 Things Every Member Can Do to Reverse the Record Low Baptism Rates. Quote, "The growth of the church is stalling. The number of convert baptisms is at a 30-year low. Missionary effectiveness, as measured in missionary to convert ratio, has plummeted through the floor to a 40-year low. And the growth percentage of the church is at a 50-year low. We effectively have twice as many missionaries as we did in the 1980s, yet we are having the same amount of convert baptisms, if not less." End quote. Here's from another Faithful Mormons blog on Cumorah.com. Quote, "As of late December, the church in the United States reported no net change for the number of congregations for the entire year. To contrast, the church in the United States has historically reported a net increase of 100 to 150 new wards and branches every year during the past decade." From later on, membership growth rates have also continued to decelerate. Annual membership growth rates decreased to the lowest level reported by the church since 1988 during 2016, cited at 0.9%. To contrast, the church generally reported annual membership growth rates of approximately 2% in the late 1990s and early 2000s, approximately 1.5% between the mid-2000s and early 2010s, and approximately 1% in the mid-2010s. Now, those numbers were given to contrast where the church's current growth rate sits at 0.9%. He continues, "Decreases in the number of convert baptisms due to the increasing influence of secularism on society, ineffective or inconsistent proselytism approaches, higher mortality rates among Latter-day Saints due to an aging LDS population, and reduced birth rates have all appeared to contribute to this noticeable decline in American membership growth during the 21st century." End quote. This same article posts other holdups, including lack of progress in Mexico, congregational decline in South Korea, stake ward and branch consolidation in Europe due to stagnation, a Russian mission closing, and overall lack of progress in Asia. But one place with astronomical growth is Africa. Some indicators show church growth to be hovering around a solid 7.5% to 8%. Compared to less than 1% in America. Which leads us to read this Deseret News article titled, "Dowry is not the Lord's Way." In Kenya, LDS President Nelson says tithing breaks the poverty cycle. I cannot wait to read through this with you guys, okay? This is how it begins. Nairobi, Kenya. To listen Monday to an LDS Church's president's voice in person for the first time, East African Mormons traveled hundreds of miles in dust-covered buses, bouncing and swaying over dirt roads, broken streets, and omnipresent speed bumps that keep speeds under 50 miles per hour. They received a message tailored for Eastern Africa, where many tribes continued to insist that grooms or their families provide a dowry or pay a price for a bride. So, yeah, dowries. That used to be a fairly consistent practice in America. It kind of went away around what it seems like maybe the 60s and 70s. The dowries kind of stopped being the cultural norm. Turns out in Africa, dowries are still largely a part of the cultural practice. Now, this is where it goes on to quote Russell M. Nelson. This is still from the Deseret News. "That's not the Lord's way," President Russell M. Nelson told about 2,000 Kenyans and other Africans Monday night inside a large oval wooden event center styled after traditional huts in Nairobi, Kenya. "The Lord's way is to be married in the temple for time and all eternity with your children sealed to you." He added that if he had to pay for his wife, "I would have missed 5 children because only with my last 5 was I out of debt." End quote. Now, this article just gets worse and worse. We're going to continue to read extracts from it. President Nelson also said, "Tithing can break cycles of poverty in poor nations and family." This is directly quoting from President Nelson. "We preach tithing to the poor people of the world because the poor people of the world have had cycles of poverty generation after generation. That same poverty continues from one generation to another until people pay their tithing." Okay, let's just try and set that aside by summarizing it. Tithing breaks the poverty cycle. Giving 10% of your money to a church breaks the poverty cycle. That's just a bold assertion with absolutely no evidence to back it up. Unfortunately, facts don't really matter in all of this, but still, that alone is a very damaging idea. Now, we have to grant that this can help, right? So if you have a group of people who decide to give up 5 or 10% of all of their possessions, of all of their income or whatever, and put that into community efforts, right? You're building a park, building tourist locations, building a community center where they have, recreation centers, stuff like that. If you have people pooling their money for that, eventually you need a system to organize that, and we call that a government, right? But people pooling those resources in order to build up the community, yes, that can bring a community out of poverty. But when all of that money is taken out of the hands of extremely poor people and funneled straight back to Salt Lake City, thousands and thousands of miles away from the people who actually need that money in order to help build their community up and take them out of poverty, it seems like that's kind of a fatal flaw in this entire formula. Continuing on, "Many Africans began saving money and planning their travel more than a month ago to attend what was billed here as a special devotional." So, these people who attended, many of them began saving money and planning their travel more than a month ago. How many of you would need to save money for more than a month to buy a bus ticket to take you a couple hundred miles right now? That's what, $60, $70 right now? How many of you have to save up for 2 months, 3 months, 4 months in order to afford that? I mean, I'm sure there are a number of you, but the disparity between the considered poverty that is below the baseline of the general welfare of Americans today compared to the baseline of general poverty in Africa, I think there's a discrepancy here which cannot be reconciled. And we're going to discuss that here in a minute here. This is another quote from President Nelson. "You folks are pioneers right here in Kenya. You might not think of yourself as pioneers, but you are just as much pioneers now as Brigham Young and the Saints were following the martyrdom of the prophet Joseph Smith." His 35-minute address was worth 16 hours of rough travel, said Palaasi Charles, age 49, out of Jinja, Uganda. And they go on to quote a number of people. I'll just read a couple of extracts. "I wish I'd come with my family," said Charles, a first counselor in the Jinja LDS stake presidency. He said he will return home and relay the special devotional's message to his family and the Mormon congregations in his area. "I will share with them the importance of us having Temple recommends, that tithing is going to break the cycle of poverty, the importance of educating our children and doing away with dowry as part of our culture." That is a direct quote from somebody who is an first counselor in the LDS stake presidency in the Jinja LDS stake. Taking these teachings to heart. But, you're living in incredibly impoverished area in Africa, and you have these, this entourage of extremely wealthy, well-dressed, suited white men show up and tell you how to get out of poverty, people who run these massive temples that you dream of going to one day, you're going to take their advice, regardless of whether or not it's good advice. There's just an incredible discrepancy between the lives that these people lead. We're going to talk about this soon, but there's a lack of empathy on multiple points here. I don't know how long it will take to build that temple, President Nelson said, but let's have a little contest. See if you can build your lives to be ready and your ancestral documentation to be ready for when the temple comes. Make sure that you all have your temple recommends. Make sure that you're all paid up on those back due tithing. It's no different for you than it is for me, he said. You can get personal revelation for your own circumstances just as naturally as I can get from my circumstances. You get it for your family and yourself. I get it for the whole church. There you go. A total of 67 members of 4 LDS branches in the Eldoret area, 200 miles northwest of Nairobi, met at 9 p.m. Sunday, but their bus did not show up until 12:30 a.m. They arrived at 7 a.m. and began a 10-hour wait for the meeting. I'm reading that because it just exhibits what these people are willing to go through in order to hear the prophet of God, right? They're willing to go through these extreme extent of saving up money for months in order to be able to afford a bus ride to be able to see the prophets, because they believe that this is what they need to do for their salvation. This is a heartbreaking quote. We've been planning and preparing to make this trip since we learned he was coming, said Jane Malaquin, a food package maker and second counselor in the Sociani Branch Relief Society. We didn't sleep, but we are not tired. We are full of energy to see the prophet. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. He is the second prophet to come here in the history of the church. I mean, okay. I'll read just one more quote from, this is Jeffrey R. Holland. Nothing will bless you more, he said. Nothing will unite your family more. Nothing will bless your children more. Nothing will bless your ancestors more. Quite frankly, there is nothing that will bless you in any way more than your attendance at the temple. A place of peace, a place of revelation, a place of joy, a place of comfort, a place of purity, all the best things in life. End quote. The rest of the article is heartbreaking. And then it basically shows that the presidency that visited here, this is President Russell M. Nelson as well as Apostle Jeffrey R. Holland, they are what can we say? Colonialization isn't dead. They're going to Africa and saying something that you're doing in your culture is not the right way to do it. If you just take part in our culture, you'll be saved, and that nothing on the earth will be better for you than to take part in our culture, to go attend our massive white buildings that are not built in order to be a community building center. They're not built for resource distribution. They're not built to help these people get jobs. They're just built for sacred rituals, depending on how you view it. This is just, wow. There's so much to say about this, but how this article has been dealt with in, let me just say it, my echo chambers has been absolutely delightful to watch. And the amount of cognitive dissonance and frustration that this action by the prophet has caused in believing circles has been even more fun to watch. Now, it's abundantly clear that Tad Walsh and the Deseret News didn't understand how the public would deal with this information when the article was published, and I don't see any rational way for them to deal with this backlash. This is Dr. Evil stroking a white cat levels of villainy for so many reasons. But let's not talk past each other. That happens too much. It absorbs too much of our time, just shouting and talking about the same issues, but never addressing each other's concerns. Let's talk with each other. The church spends $40 million a year on humanitarian aid. It organized 60,000 people to help vaccinate African children starting in 2003. It's provided water filtration systems for 380,000 Africans in 2017 alone. It's trained thousands of volunteers in third world countries to provide neonatal care, and it's donated 55,000 wheelchairs to disabled people in 2017 alone. These are all good things, and the reasons why we provide tax exemptions to religions. based on the assumption that the amount that they save by not paying taxes will go to help communities in need worldwide. These are all valid arguments that the church provides for people's needs worldwide, and that $40 million a year in humanitarian effort is more than most religions. Let's validate those arguments and commend the church on the aid that it provides. With that information in mind, let's view it with a larger scope. Temples, they can cost anywhere from $5 to $35 million to build, and that's dependent on land prices, a number of other factors, right? They're one of the church's primary investments. They build temples in areas where they can recoup the investment costs from tithing. Eventually, temples pay for themselves, and they begin making the church money after enough years of regular temple recommend holders paying their tithing. Plans for the church to expand its African market have been in the works since the early 1990s, and there's currently a temple in the planning stages in Kenya where this meeting was held in Nairobi. This is from LDSchurchtemples.org. Quote, in February 1998, President Gordon B. Hinckley, accompanied by Elder Jeffrey R. Holland of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, embarked on an international tour of 5 African countries and locations in Canada, the Canary Islands, and Cape Verde. During the afternoon of February 17, 1998, President Hinckley arrived in Nairobi, Kenya, where he addressed some 900 members in a conference room at his hotel. Members were elated to meet the prophet and traveled from as far as Ethiopia, Somalia, Tanzania, and Uganda to be with him. Because not all could afford a trip to Nairobi, some members joined their money together to send representatives who could come back and relate the experience of being with the prophet of the Lord. Wow. During his remarks, President Hinckley said, "There isn't the slightest doubt in my mind that the time will come, if you will walk in faith and patience, that a temple will be built in this land to serve the needs of the people. Now don't count on it for a few years, but it will be so." End quote. And finally, during the April 2017 conference, President Thomas S. Monson announced plans for the Nairobi, Kenya temple. The same article continues, quote, "It will be the 8th temple constructed on the continent of Africa. There are 3 operating African temples, including the Alba, Nigeria temple, Accra, Ghana temple, and Johannesburg, South Africa temple. 2 temples are under construction, including the Kinshasa Democratic Republic of the Congo temple and Durban, South Africa temple. And 2 other temples, in addition to Nairobi, have been announced: the Abidjan Ivory Coast temple and the Harare, Zimbabwe temple. There are 2 stakes and 4 districts operating in the nation of Kenya, with 3 stakes in neighboring Uganda. Many other saints living in the outlying regions of East Africa, who currently must travel to the distant Johannesburg, South Africa temple, will be immensely blessed by the Nairobi, Kenya temple." End quote. Expanding into Africa. Now, what I'll say about this is my opinion, but any business model which requires expanding to areas with limited internet access, limited infrastructure, and a woefully lacking education system in order to survive, a business model like that should cause anybody to take pause. And let's wrap this into a central point. The church spends a lot of money on humanitarian aid. But is the trade-off of giving the church billions of dollars in tax breaks worth the millions of dollars it gives back to the world in humanitarian aid? Does it spend more time and resources helping people than it does for its own aggrandizement? Now, this is a complicated subject, and there was a Twitter thread that perfectly captured the perspective, which allows what Nelson said to these Africans to be a morally good thing. I'm not going to say this Twitter handle because I don't want to, dox the person here, but I'm just going to read the thread to you. This is the perspective that we need to understand and validate in order to talk about the central issue of whether or not it's truly moral to ask people living on $1 a day to give 10% of their money to a multi-billion-dollar corporation. Here's the thread, quote, "I see a lot of shade being thrown at President Nelson's way for telling poor saints in Africa to pay tithing. I can't speak to their experiences. I've never lived with poverty, some of them have. But I do feel the need to defend tithe paying to those bagging it on Twitter. Growing up, my parents were poor. Neither of them had the opportunity to attend college, and my dad had spent his entire life working production jobs to provide. They're in a good place now, but when I was a kid, it was rough. They were on wick to feed us, and I remember one Christmas my parents had saved everything they had to get me an Easy Bake oven. We spent several weeks primarily eating Easy Bake recipes because we had nothing else. Around this time, my parents got really good at paying tithing. The crazy thing is, poor as we were, I never felt it. My dad got hit by a car and couldn't work for 6 months. They paid what they had in money and time. Cash and food frequently showed up on our doorstep. Interesting. This family was obviously in a tight situation. They kept paying tithing. They kept, I assume, attending the temple. And then magically, cash and food showed up on their doorstep frequently. I did well enough in school to get scholarships at BYU and USU. I knew my parents couldn't afford tuition. I ended up switching between schools the week before school started, and though they initially told me it would be impossible to claim my scholarship, they stunningly made an exception, almost as if it was a miracle. I was unemployed for 6 months after college due to anxiety, but I paid what tithing I could from an internship. I walked into a local store to apply on a whim, and the hiring manager immediately stopped to say hi. She later said she felt an overwhelming feeling to hire me, almost like it's a miracle. Not even a month ago, I found out that my hours were getting cut to $16 a week. This after my roommate moved out and left me paying $600 a month for rent and $260 a month in car payments, excluding phone and utilities. The idea of paying tithing terrified me, but I paid it. I put out a plea for a new job and a place to live on Twitter. I later learned I couldn't move out or I'd immediately have to pay $1,200. Not only did you guys recommend places to work, but you sent money through Venmo. I cried all week because it was just enough to get me by. Almost like it's a miracle. Within a week, I learned that my car payment due dates had been put off for a year, and I didn't have to make another payment for a year. Almost like it's a miracle. Then employees in a department I used to work in kept getting sick, and they asked me to help, which has given me overtime. Almost like it's a miracle. Paying tithing gets you opportunities, moves obstacles, and gets you by. I can't explain it in any other way. It's so hard sometimes. I've been poor and every penny feels like $10, but tithing works. I'm not going to pretend that it makes you rich. I've never been that. But I know that blessings come from tithes. Whether those blessings be given souls put in your path, money being stretched further than expected, or opportunities to earn. End quote. Given that perspective, tithing manifests blessings in ways that we can never understand, and God is always going to have our back if we just pay our tithing. That line of logic is what Nelson used in order to tell these Kenyans that tithing will get them out of poverty, and it seems to validate itself. Now, to be clear, I can't imagine any economics major or professor who would agree with the logic that giving up 10% of your money to a worldwide company who uses the money for temples which don't help the poor makes you richer by any stretch of imagination. That's just flawed. But that's the logic or lack thereof being used to make Nelson's sermon a moral one. And the justification he used to tell these incredibly impoverished Kenyans, if you just pay 10% of your money to us, you'll break the cycle of poverty. Now, there are many ways to view this issue. I'll simply say for myself, I think this was a truly deplorable and ignorant thing to say. Nelson and his entourage have never lived at any level of poverty these people live with every single day, okay? This prophet has never been hungry because he truly couldn't afford food. He's never had to deal with not knowing where he's going to be sleeping at night. He's never known what it's like to live in a completely different world, aside from the 2 years that he spent, on his mission when he was largely insulated from anything truly terrible happening. Worse than that, he can't even get his own mind into a place where what he was teaching could be viewed as an immoral thing. Now, instead of trying to view this from a believing Mormon's perspective or from an economics perspective and talking past each other, I'm just going to leave you with a final thought on how this teaching seems to conflict with Mormon doctrine. This is from the Book of Mormon, inside the Book of Mormon, chapter 8, verse 36, quote, "And I know that ye do walk in the pride of your hearts, and there are none save a few only, who do not lift themselves up in the pride of their hearts, unto the wearing of very fine apparel, unto envying and strifes and malice and persecutions and all manner of iniquities. And your churches, yea, even every one, have become polluted because of the pride of your hearts. For behold, ye do love money, and your substance and your fine apparel and the adorning of your churches more than ye love the poor and the needy, the sick and afflicted. O ye pollutions, ye hypocrites, ye teachers, who sell yourselves for that which will canker. Why have ye polluted the holy church of God? Why are ye ashamed to take upon you the name of Christ? Why do you think that greater is the value of an endless happiness than that misery which never dies, because of the praise of the world? Why do ye adorn yourselves with that which has no life, and yet suffer the hungry and the needy and the naked and the sick and afflicted to pass by you and notice them not? Yea, why do ye build up your secret abominations to get gain, and cause that widows should mourn before the Lord, and also orphans to mourn before the Lord, and also blood of the fathers and their husbands to cry unto the Lord from the ground, for vengeance upon your heads? Behold, the sword of vengeance hangeth over you. And the time soon cometh that he avengeth the blood of the saints upon you, for he will not suffer their cries any longer. End quote. All right, that will do it for the episode today. Just have a little bit of house cleaning to discuss. Little follow-up on the Protect LDS Children campaign. I would recommend going and looking at the Facebook page for Protect LDS Children. There was a live feed, a live Facebook post that Sam Young did. And this was on Tuesday, April 17th, 2018, where it discussed how the movement is going to operate moving forward. And he articulated that there will be a protest on June 3rd of going to the church, of everybody going to church with buttons. This is going to be on a fast and testimony meeting. Hopefully people will go with their buttons and go and voice their support for protecting LDS children. I'll just point you over to the Sam Young and Protect LDS Children Facebook pages to find out more information there if you want to follow up and conduct local protests instead of, going to the actual church in Salt Lake City and protesting by marching in the streets. These are much more subtle, but I think more effective protests. So just keep that in mind. I also wanted to just let everybody know we didn't have a Patreon-only episode this week. Regularly, we release a Patreon episode on Monday, and then this regular episode airs on Thursday night. But to be frank, this week I was a bit too wrapped up in a couple of other projects in order to get the Monday Patreon episode out like usual. My apologies for that. The first project I'm not at liberty to discuss just yet, but it should be in the public sphere relatively soon. The other project was a presentation at the Satanic Temple Seattle congregation, where a friend and I gave a presentation on the role of Lucifer in Mormonism. It was a really fun presentation, and the local Satanic Temple chapter is full of a lot of really great people. I'll be posting up a video of it hopefully this weekend. So I really quickly want to give a shout out to Lilith and Bevan for setting up all of the logistics of the presentation, as well as to Tarkus and Vapula for their help with all of the video equipment. And of course, a huge thanks to everybody who attended. It was really, really fun. So you'll find the video of it on the Naked Mormonism YouTube channel pretty soon, and I'll let you know next week when it airs and include a link in the show notes. So with that said, I wanted to thank our newest patrons. Looks like we have a pledge from Palouse and from Happy Hubby. So thank you to both of you so much. Your hard-earned dollars are going to support the journalism and the research that goes into this show, as well as funding the time for putting together these various presentations and the video editing and everything. So thank you so much for doing that. Thank you so much to all of the patrons who support at patreon.com/nakedmormonism, and they get all of the extra content that airs every Monday night, all of the extra interviews, all of the Name Home evenings, tons of extra content over on that side. So if you want to join up with that content and join the message boards on the Patreon side, be sure to sign up to support for as little as $1 an episode. It'd be really great to have you on board. All of that said, let's go ahead and shut the episode down for the night. First off, I want to thank Julie for running the Twitter and Facebook pages. She's our social media guru. She keeps the conversation going over there. Be sure to give us a follow and give her a follow at The Real Emma Hale on Twitter. Thank you to Natalie Newell for being the production assistant on the back end. Thanks to Jason Camo for providing the music used in the show with his permission. You can find his music at aloststateofmind.com. Thanks to Brian Ziegenhagen for being our audio engineer, and thank you to Andrew Torres of the Opening Arguments podcast and the law offices of P. Andrew Torres for being the legal counsel for this show. Thank you so much once again to all the patron supporters, and most importantly, thank you to the fantastically amazing listeners out there once again for lending me your ear. Hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. The preceding podcast is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2018, all rights reserved.